What's up guys, Vulkan here, and today we're talking about Wolcen. With the game in hibernation at the moment while the studio fixes things, I wanted to take a moment to look back at what happened with this one, right? What happened with Wolcen, starting a few weeks before launch. Wolcen was heading into launch with incredible hype, buckets of potential. People were stoked. The game was finally launching, right? People were clamoring for more details. They were banging on the gates trying to get in. And I mean, they were right. This game had been in development for like 6 years. It was an eternity. But the thing was, we finally saw a finish line. There was finally something in front of us that we could see. No more delays, and we got closer and closer and closer. And they were amping things up with skills and modifiers, and they were finally ready to pull the trigger on this game. So just to give you guys a little bit of my perspective, while people were banging on the gates, content creators like myself were given review copies of the game, an extensive NDA, like the most extensive NDA I've ever had to do, and told there would be some changes in a day one patch which addressed some of the issues other people had reported. So everything was good, normal. And for the most part, I played offline. I didn't want to play online in case they did a character wipe. I didn't want to play online in case there was online issues and I lost my character, so I chose the safe bet and was like, you know what? I'm going to play offline, and I didn't have any issues. I leveled my Plague Lord build that a lot of you had seen in a couple videos, and I was able to clear everything, and it was normal. Business as usual in terms of Wolcen offline mode. But before launch, I had already created some videos and scheduled them to upload once the game went live, which you guys saw, right? The review, copy, the starter guide, all of those things. And these ended up being a bit misleading, right? There were so many issues with the online part of the game that I didn't encounter in my offline playthrough. So for that, sorry guys. I did learn that, you know what, I should probably play online despite my hesitation and my reservations about it in order to give you guys a holistic picture. So that was a lesson for me as a content creator. Now, before we dive into Wolcen's rocky launch, I did want to put in a disclaimer. I understand there are more issues than the ones I mentioned here, right? Everyone experienced a wide variety of issues, but I'm focusing on the major, large impact ones that affected the community as a whole. And I also want to say that I want Wolcen to be successful, right? I want them to be as successful as they possibly can be. I mean, no one wants to wish ill will on anybody else. But we need to examine the past to be better in the future, and that's what we're doing now. And at the end, I'm going to have a list of things that I think they should change or adjust or focus on, and I want to hear your guys' list as well. So let's get into it. I want to talk about the online issues first, since these were a catalyst for what would be the chain of effect through the game's launch and overall reception. So day one, there were issues with connecting to the game as both a party or solo, right? So many times people would try to start up Wolcen, they would run into issues trying to start a game before it failed out and threw an error, which was terrible. You had tons of people that took off vacation, you had people that took off time from work, that really were, coordinating with friends and family. Hey, wife, watch the kids, I'm going to play with the guys for a while, whatever. They had plans set up, and unfortunately, it didn't work out. There was a lot of online issues, but really this was just the tip of the online iceberg. Players experienced issues with synchronization. They were losing quest progress, items, progression. Some even found their stashes and gear wiped. And it was amplified by the fact that once they did get into the game, they were met with performance issues like crashes, FPS drops, and there was other gameplay affecting bugs, and it wasn't a good overall experience for the first few days. A lot of people struggled and got very, very frustrated. Some people left and never came back because they just chalked it up to a bad loss and refunded it on Steam. Now, online also led to headaches for the Wolcen devs, like players being able to duplicate items and gold, which completely killed the trading economy right out of the gate. Gold had lost so much value that you didn't want to sell any of your items for really any form of currency. You just wanted to barter item for item. I will give you my trial belt if you give me your frostweave, that exact stuff. But I mean, even at that point, there was a short window between patches where you could duplicate items, which then killed that value as well, because somebody could duplicate 15 trial belts and then hand those things out and trade for what they actually needed. So it was just not a great look in the first opening days and the opening week with the economy. But luckily, the Wolcen devs, they were able to move pretty quickly to tackle all of these issues, and ultimately people were able to play online somewhat consistently in a party a few days after launch. So that was a very kind of short-lived issue, so I'm glad that got remediated early on. But the issue was their kind of hasty hotfixes led to another revelation that was shared in a forum post surrounding their server partner. Shortly after launch, they did inform us that they would only be able to apply one hotfix per week due to the contract they negotiated with their server vendor. This led to much longer delays to fix the smaller annoying bugs that existed and would play a part in all of the issues that kind of followed this. I mean, being able to apply one patch per week is just brutal because you have to wait till that patch Tuesday, patch Thursday. It wasn't consistent, and that was part of the issue. You didn't know what got put into a patch. You didn't know if, okay, is, the node I'm looking for getting put into the patch? Is this going to fix the issue I have with performance? Is this going to fix the issue that I'm having? And you didn't really know until the patch came and it went, and if it went and your stuff wasn't fixed, you had to wait another week in order to get back into the game, and that caused a lot of people to leave. Once people were able to reliably play the game and progress through the campaign into early endgame, we started to see some overpowered builds emerge, but not in a good way. The first was the spin to win build using the Child of Fury node that doubled all your damage while above a certain amount of rage. So when you cast Blade Storm, it would take a snapshot of your rage and then apply that double damage buff as long as you held down the button, which allowed people to clear things rather quickly. It was an efficient build and a justifiable one kind of early on, right? It wasn't exactly over the top or outrageous, and it still kind of struggled a little bit with bosses. And it was one that everyone gravitated towards early on until the bleeding edge hysteria began. Now, before I get into this, I did want to explain what Bleeding Edge is and what made it so powerful. So Bleeding Edge, it's a skill that you can cast, and you cast a spinning blade around the player one time. So you click it, blade spins around you, hits everything in an AoE around you. If you took specific modifiers, then you could have the blade last longer and continue spinning in orbit around the player while they moved for a short duration. So this allowed the player to cast the spell, deal damage with the orbiting blade, and then move at the same time, kind of chopping through hordes of enemies, right? And it was a good skill. I liked the design, I liked everything about it, and it was just fun to use. Now, the skill itself wasn't the most powerful piece of the puzzle, but it was the ailments that Bleeding Edge could apply so quickly and on the move. But just like Bleeding Edge, the ailments weren't actually the things that did the damage. Sure, you could do damage with them, you'd see their numbers tick and things like that, but it was small potatoes. They were small numbers. They simply allowed players to stack up insane damage buffs through a node called Immortal Offering, in a combination with a few others in Wolcen's passive skill tree. This node would give you a stacking buff for each ailment you applied to an enemy, which resulted in players stacking damage from all elemental types in order to stack as many buffs as possible. Now this in particular is where the damage came from. With all of these buffs, Bleeding Edge hit like a meteor, just nuked everything in its path with minimal work or gear needed. You basically just need to stack up a variety of ailments, you would get massive amounts of DPS, and just wipe everything out. So Bleeding Edge combined with ailments created such an easy button for players, and they loved it. They just soaked it up. They're like, this is amazing. I can just click this one button and I can kill everything, and I can teleport around depending on how my build's set up, and it's great. Players were able to fly through all the in-game expeditions and hit the cap of 187 within a few days of launch, and this is something that the Wolcen devs said would take a few months. So you're talking a few months where Wolcen devs are going, hey, we have a couple months to start developing stuff and continue developing and finishing and doing all this stuff while players are working through in-game. It got capped in a couple of days. And that, one, was startling for both the players and for the devs. Just, whoa. But before long, right, everyone was rocking the Bleeding Edge build. And they had hit the end of the road in terms of new content, right? They had hit 187, they were working on their city, and that's it. Which led to the inevitable questions, right? What comes next? When are we getting new stuff? Which then put pressure on the devs. Now, Wolcen devs attempted to rectify the whole gold duping and Bleeding Edge builds with patches 1.0.5 and 1.0.6. And they did so by eliminating the gold duping bug, right? Which was good. So you could no longer gold dupe. But it also reset everyone's gold amounts to a portion of what they had before, because they're trying to fix the economy, and they wanted to kind of wipe out these players who had banks and just massive hordes of gold. So in order to do that, they reset everybody's gold to a portion of what they had. And unfortunately, there were a lot of people who kind of got swept up in this, who had farmed massive amounts of golds in a legit manner, right? They had just played a ton, they found a good kind of system they had, and they farmed just a giant bankroll of gold. And they were targeted and ultimately left the game because they saw their bank account accidentally chopped in half. They had put all this time and effort into accruing all of this currency, and then all of a sudden, it was gone. The second part of that patch gutted Bleeding Edge's combat efficiency quite a bit. So the node that allowed the blade to continue spinning after use, which was probably the most powerful part of the whole thing, Unstoppable Momentum, had a 10-second cooldown added to it, which forced players to no longer use that node, and they eventually either tried to kind of patchwork Bleeding Edge back together and did so with limited success, or they just moved on to different skills that they could find a build around. So it really kind of killed off the Bleeding Edge thing as a whole. And after the nerfs, players became frustrated. They could no longer tackle content they previously did with ease, right? I mean, some players dropped from being able to farm 187 expeditions to grinding through 118s in order to find gear for another build, because anything higher than a 118 was either too difficult or it took way too long to finish and it wasn't worth your time. So this led to a big exodus of players who felt the nerf was too strong, completely killed their fun in the game, and they ended up leaving. Now, Bleeding Edge is kind of getting all the credit and all the glory here, but there were other builds that accomplished the same feat, and they did feel the wrath of the nerf hammer, right? You had Frozen Grasp. That was another really, really big one where you could set it to 0 cooldown and just spam it for as much mana as you had or willpower. And Bleeding Edge, though, was the most notable, so that was the one that really threw a lot of people off. But like we described above, right, the problem wasn't only Bleeding Edge. Part of the problem were the ailments, and these are still around. These ailments and these ailment builds are still the go-to way to clear out Wolcen content. So really they just swapped out Bleeding Edge for something else. Gunslinger's Mark was another one for a while that just applied a ton of ailments and was able to wipe out content. Then Bladestorm kind of had a comeback there for a little while. So there's quite a few things, but it all comes down to the same thing: ailments and the Immortal Offering node in combination with a few others. So before the Bleeding Edge hype had really kind of swallowed up the community as a whole, there were actually reports of many of the nodes on the skill tree weren't working properly due to either bugs, poor math calculations, and these math calculations quickly became a meme actually within the game due to some nodes being incredibly overpowered or underpowered based upon their logic, which led to the search for the next big build, right? You have this broken node that's incredibly overpowered, like the node that added massive amounts of DPS based upon shield block due to a typo in the math equation. 50 multiplied is much different than 0.5 multiplied. So a lot of people, maybe even without knowing, would use that broken node and go, okay, this is pretty cool. And then they're seeing massive amounts of damage and they're like, whoa, this is badass. And paired with something like Flight of Gavanir, which is hammer throw, it can make your shield block 100%, which then gives you massive amount of DPS in combination with this node. And people are just using it, having a good time. And next thing you know, those nodes get nerfed or they get adjusted, fixed, right, due to typos. And next thing you know, their build is completely dead and they have to move on to something else. So these broken nodes eventually caused more headaches and frustration for players as they spent their hard-earned currency on respecs, right? I mean, they went out, they're farming stuff, they're getting this currency, they're working hard for it. Next thing you know, you respec, like, I really want to build my character around this node because I think it's going to be a good one. And they build around it and they get everything set up, they go out and they try it out, and the node's broken, or the logic behind it wasn't accurate. Either way, it's a dead build and it lacked punch, and they felt cheated, right? Players lost out on the time they spent grinding those resources, which ultimately led more players to leave the game for now. And over time, I mean, one of the players even created an Excel spreadsheet that had a list of what nodes worked and what nodes didn't, so players could accurately build characters by avoiding broken nodes. And this really shined a light on just how many nodes weren't working properly in the game. Like I said, either bugged or math calculations. And it really left players with a limited amount of options to use, which led to things like Immortal Offering being used in every single build. Ailments worked. They were overpowered and they worked, so everybody kind of leaned on those. But the silver lining here also was that the devs had a surefire list of nodes they could chase out and fix, which they did for the most part in patches 1.0.5, 1.0.6, and 1.0.8, in addition to fixing a lot of the skills and skill damage to bring some other skills up to on par with some of the more overpowered skills. So everything, trying to balance out everything a little bit. By the time everything was somewhat fixed and the game was performing at what should have been the launch state, the player base had dwindled to a fraction of what it was around release. And the Wolcen devs made the difficult decision to focus on bug fixes and broken gameplay elements before they add new content. I think this was absolutely 100% the right move. In today's state, it should have been fixed beforehand. Absolutely. This should have been caught in the QA process. There should have not been as many issues as there were. But with today's state as it is, you need to fix things before you start adding new things. If you add new things in and the old stuff isn't fixed, then what's the point? People are still going to be frustrated with the old stuff that's not fixed. This resulted in a delay to the highly anticipated Leagues feature until at least June 2020. These leagues would function similar to Path of Exile and would add some replayability to the game beyond the in-game systems that are present now. So with new content being delayed for a handful of months, Wolcen is currently in hibernation. The devs are working on the game to fix what's broken. Most of the players have moved on to other games in the meantime, and those who did stick around are doing what they can to help improve the game as it stands. And that's it, guys. I mean, that is the tale of Wolcen from release until now. I mean, were there other things that contributed to the decline? Well, of course. But to keep this video from going to movie length, I focused on the big ones. These are the big ones that really drove a lot of the player base away and really kind of created this rocky launch for Wolcen that ultimately led to a less than satisfactory ending. But now I want to talk about the future, right? I want to talk about, we talked about the past, let's talk about things that are coming. And like I said before, I want Wolcen to be successful, right? This game was such a large part of my YouTube career early on, and I want to continue creating content for it because at its core, it's a fun game. It is a fun game. It just needs some help along the way. So what could they do to improve? What do we want to see in Wolcen's resurgence when it wakes back up? So here is my list. 1, a more robust Q&A process. They cannot afford to have broken nodes or math calculations anymore. This includes skills. They just can't. 2, renegotiate your server contract or find another vendor. Again, we cannot afford to be limited to a patch a week. In the world of game development, you live and die by how quickly you can resolve game-breaking issues and keeping your player base around to actually play the game. 3, improving the gear chase. I mean, uniques are great items, but unfortunately they get beat out by almost every legendary, minus a few like the Trial or Frostweave that are needed to create powerful builds. Make uniques more powerful. They just raise the level tiers on them, but make them more powerful. Number 4, add back alternative in-game modes that were present in the alpha. Things like endless dungeons. So they had something that was similar to expeditions, but expeditions end after 3. These were endless. You could literally just go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and they became more and more and more difficult. Also, arena. In Alpha, there was an arena where you could challenge different bosses. You could fight through different labyrinths full of traps. There was a horde mode. Like, there was all sorts of cool stuff that was involved in these arenas, and I really, really like them. And if you beat a certain number of milestones in arena, then you were able to unlock a set. And all these set pieces came at different points, but it was a full kind of gladiator-style set. And number 5, come back with fully developed league ideas. Leagues don't need to be created on the fly. I want to see Wolcen stay at least 3 leagues ahead of the current to allow themselves time for fixes, time for development, and adjustments. And these leagues should be shared with the community, right? Titles only. We don't need like a whole thing, just titles only, and the dates that they plan on bringing them out to create accountability. So it could be something like Severe Uprising, the Herald of the Construct, and then number 3, maybe like We Are One, One Is All. And this creates anticipation, and we begin discussing what each one will be tied to, what are the different league mechanics that'll be coming with these. And they could say, hey, you know what, these are the next 3 that we're going to have. That allows them to stay 9 months ahead of the game. And they're going to have things that they can pull out of their pocket or they can fall back on if something happens. If there's a game-breaking thing or something doesn't come out right, then they can continue working on them. So guys, that really kind of wraps up my list, that wraps up this video, but I want to hear from you. What are your guys' lists? What does Wolcen need to fix for you to come back? We know the game's going to be around for quite some time, but we need to make it as fun as it possibly can be. So as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate the support. This has been Vulkan, and I'll talk to you guys next time.